part 2 of What is a Rabbi from my my book club submission, Practicing the Way by John Mark Comer. All right, so let's talk about what being a rabbi would mean, or being underneath the tutelage of a rabbi. Jewish kids started school around 5 years old at the local Bet Sefer, House of the Book, which was the equivalent of elementary school. Normally, this House of the Book was built onto the side of a synagogue and run by a full-time scribe or teacher. The curriculum was the Torah, and in an oral culture, by the age of 12 or 13, most kids would have the entire Torah memorized. So that would be Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. At that point, the vast majority of students went home, and they would apprentice in the family business or help run the farm. But the best and the brightest would go on the second level of education, called the Bet Midrash, the House of Learning, where they would continue their studies. And then by the age of 17, they would have memorized the entire Old Testament. Now, at this point, the overwhelming majority would be done and were basically told to go make babies, pray that they become rabbis, and ply your trade. But the best of the best would apply to apprentice under a rabbi. Now, this was really hard to get into. Apprenticeship programs were the equivalent of the Ivy League today, but even more exclusive. You had to find a rabbi whose yoke you were drawn to. Then, and yoke would be the set of teachings and the way of life that this rabbi was practicing. You had to resonate with that. And then you had to beg them to join his band of students. And then the rabbi would grill you. How well do you know the Torah? What's your take on Nephilim in Genesis 6? Do you side with Hillel and Shammai on Deuteronomy 24? Tell us, how often do you pray? So it'd just be random questions that could be taken from anywhere in the Old Testament. And then also talking about your practices as well. And if he thought you had the smarts, the work ethic, and the chutzpah to one day become a rabbi yourself, he would say something like, "Come, follow me." Do those words sound familiar? Or another way to translate that is, "Come, apprentice under me." So now let's say you were one of the lucky few who became an apprentice to a rabbi. From that day on, your entire life was organized around 3 driving goals. Number 1, to be with your rabbi. Jesus himself invites us and invites his disciples to be with him. You would leave your family, your village, your trade, and follow your rabbi 24/7. You were a student, but class wasn't Monday, Wednesday, Friday from 11 to 11:50 a.m. Class was life. You would spend every waking moment with your rabbi, sleeping at his side, eating at his table, sitting at his feet, and end up after long hours walking behind him from town to town, covered in his dust. All day, every day. Okay, so 3 driving goals. Number 1, to be with your rabbi. Number 2, to become like your rabbi. Jesus had this great line about how the apprentice is not above the rabbi, but everyone who is fully trained will be like their rabbi. That was the heart and soul of apprenticeship, being with your rabbi for the purpose of becoming like your rabbi. You would copy his tone of voice, his mannerisms, his figures of speech, and you wanted to be him. Okay, so be with your rabbi, become like your rabbi, and finally your goal was to do as your rabbi did. The whole point of apprenticeship was to train under a rabbi in order to one day become a rabbi yourself. If you made it through the gauntlet of discipleship, and that is a real if, then when he thought you were ready, your rabbi would turn to you and say something like, "Okay, kid, I give you my blessing. Go and make disciples." And this was what it was meant to be a disciple. And this is still what it means to be a disciple. The problem is that this is not what most Christians mean by discipleship today. Yet when you look at Jesus' model, whether in 1st century Israel or 21st century America, or wherever you're reading this, the meaning of discipleship is perfectly clear. To follow Jesus is to become his apprentice. It is to organize your entire life around 3 driving goals. Be with Jesus, become like him, do as he did. Apprenticeship to Jesus, that is, following Jesus, is a whole life process of being with Jesus for the purpose of becoming like him, and carrying on his work in the world. It's a lifelong journey in which we gradually learn to say and do the kinds of things Jesus said and did as we apprentice under him every facet of our lives. Put another way, disciple is a noun. All right, so this kind of ties into another talk that I did on it. Are you an apprentice? And what's good about thinking about this right now that you've got the full picture of what it meant to be an apprentice, it was an absolute privilege, and it was something that was not offered to everyone, right? It wasn't offered to everyone. My talk on whoever means whoever, it was very radical to have a rabbi go, whoever wants to follow me, you just come, take up your cross, follow me. And so it is something where in certain cultures, if you have an understanding of what a rabbi is about, for example, the Jewish culture, this would be very easy to understand. But I don't really think there's anything in the American culture and the Western culture that really teaches us like that narrowing down, other than maybe something like getting onto a sports team or getting into a top-notch college. Maybe even an interview process on some level, especially with those premium jobs. But to be constantly narrowed down, to work so hard for something, like, let's go back. So you've memorized the first 5 books of the Old Testament, and then you memorize the full Old Testament. And even with that, a rabbi had to see something in you. So you could go and you could pick whoever you'd like to apprentice under, but they had to see something about how you were living, what you were doing, what your whether or not you truly had taken in the expertise that would be found in these books of the Bible. And then you could still go all throughout that whole process, and they'd still tell you, no, just head on back to your life, have a nice life, have children, maybe one of them will be a rabbi. So basically, thank you, but no thank you. And so again, going back to these words where Jesus says, come, follow me, I will make you fishers of men, or apprentice with me, follow me. To have that go to whosoever wants to was a really big deal. All right, if you have any other subsequent questions, make sure and send them down in the comments. And of course, if you'd like, pick up the book, Practicing the Way by John Mark Comer.